In this lesson we're gonna learn how to, once again, how to defend against the scholar's mate. So different variations of how your opponent can go after you and bring that queen out early, which we say you're actually not supposed to do. You're supposed to bring the queen after you developed other pieces, and the queen comes in combination with other pieces and it delivers the final attack. But if you try to do it too early, it could succeed in winning you an early game, but at the same time, if your opponent has a good strategy, it would be difficult for you to succeed with that kind of strategy of getting the queen out too early, trying to get a scholar's mate. So let's see different ideas, variations for the queen to come out and try to do that early checkmate. So pawn push forward. This is the opening that we're going to be using quite a bit. So where one central pawn is meeting the other pawn right here in the middle, and in this case we're going to bring the queen right away out there to h5. So when the queen comes out to h5, black's pawn on e5 is actually hanging, and the queen is aiming for the square right there on f7. So at this point, black can make a mistake by attacking the queen, saying, well, the queen out too early, let's go ahead and attack it. Now if the knight comes out and attacks the queen will be ready to pick up this pawn right here, which is not defended. And if pawn attacks the queen, same thing, but even worse for black, because after queen takes the pawn, the queen is making a check, so this becoming a double attack, where the queen is making a check to the king, which black is going to have to defend. For example, offering to exchange the queens, but instead of taking the queen, which is just going to be exchanged, which is going to be just a trade, now white is already one pawn ahead and is going to win this rook right here in the corner. So this is not something that black would want to allow white to do. So when the queen comes out to the side, out on h5, black is going to want to defend the pawn on e5 first. So the way to do that would be to develop the knight. We don't want to take our queen out to f6 or e7 trying to defend the pawn, because we don't want to use our queen quite yet either. So we're actually going to want to develop the knight first to c6 and defend the pawn. But now white's got an idea. White is actually taking out another one of the pieces and attacking the f7 square, which the queen is hitting right here from the side. Queen wants to make a checkmate. Black is going to block that. And the way to block it is not by attacking the queen with the knight. This is probably the biggest mistake black can make in this position, is allow white to deliver that checkmate right there. Boom, queen takes f7, and this is a checkmate. How is this a checkmate? Well, the queen is attacking the king right here, and the bishop is supporting the queen. The bishop is defending the queen, while the queen is hitting the king. And this is going to be a checkmate. Now, the bishop is hitting the pawn on f7, the queen is hitting the pawn on f7. So how do we block them off? We can try blocking the bishop, but this is not going to be quite successful because the pawn and the bishop both guarding the square on d5. d5 pawn push forward will just allow white to win the pawn on d5 and won't be able to permanently defend the f7. Now if we can actually block the queen from hitting the f7 square, that's what's going to help us defend against the checkmate. So black is going to go and play g6, attacking the queen, blocking the queen from reaching the f7 square that we actually talked about. It is very dangerous for you to allow your opponent to try to get access to that square. So the queen is going to go back to f3, attacking the square on f7. From f3, so the bishop is hitting the square from c4, and then the queen is hitting the f7 square from f3. So now we actually got to defend against the queen. So how do we do that? We could bring our queen out here, offering to exchange it. Both knight and the queen controlling the f6 square. There's no way we can allow white to get that pawn on f7. For example, an attacking looking move like knight d4 attacking the queen will once again run into the biggest trouble right here we can imagine. Queen takes f7. And this is once again checkmate in one move. And black lost the game. So this is not something you guys want to happen to you. So as the queen retreats back to f3, we're going to want to defend playing knight f6. And this once again, the queen is defending the knight, so the queen cannot be sacrificed for the knight. The queen cannot win that knight. And at this point, white's attack is pretty much running out of steam. We're going to try to make another counterattack. Queen going back to b3. Another attack from the queen. The queen went to the corner here to h5, f3, and then coming to b3, trying to hit that square on f7. Now the bishop and the queen are working together. So this is actually two pieces working together. So in a way, we can use those combinations to try to attack the queen plus another piece. But look, at the same time, all of these pieces are here just standing and watching. They're passive observers and they're not engaged in the game. They're not creating pressure on your opponent. They're not developing. They're just being here passively sitting around, sleeping basically in their positions here. So at this point, we can try to either defend the pawn playing queen e7, or we can try to go for a counterattack at this point, which would involve pushing the pawn forward, would block off this bishop, and when pawn captures, we're gonna go ahead and bring the knight forward over to d4. We're sacrificing a pawn and attacking the queen right here. At this point, as you guys can see, these bishops are both ready to come out. The knight on f6 is very active. It could also jump forward, and the queen is gonna start getting punched around. For example, let's say the queen goes over to c3. What we're gonna do, we can jump the knight forward and attack the queen already. Okay, so this is why you guys don't want to have the queen out too early, because it becomes a target to all the other pieces. So let's imagine the queen goes over to c3. Now we're gonna go ahead and attack the queen with the bishop here. Bishop is gonna go and attack the queen on c3. So now you could say, well, bishop is not defended. Why don't we just capture that bishop with a queen? Okay, now if queen takes b4, we're going to deliver a fork. The queen is now going to be, along with the king, is going to become a target. So knight go ahead and takes on c2, where knight is going to be making a fork to the king and the queen right here. As well as the rook. This is actually a triple fork. But obviously once the king moves, we're going to go ahead and pick up this queen right there on b4. So bishop coming out to b4, attacking the queen. The queen is going to have to move once again. So the queen goes over to d3, and at this point we're going to bring another one of the pieces and attack the queen. So the bishop is going to come out to f5. Bishop coming out to f5, hitting the queen right here on d3. And at this point, as the queen is going to be leaving, knight is going to be able to go ahead and make a fork on the king and the rook once again, at least winning a rook right there in the corner. Probably quite a bit more, since the king is exposed, white's pieces are really behind and not really well developed. So at this point we're going to consider white's strategy as failing, because the queen is out in the open, just about the only piece that developed besides the bishop, and all of these pieces are not developed, and white is about to lose the rook out there in the corner. Now let's take a look at another one of those ways that your opponent can create the attack, getting the queen out early, and with the similar idea of creating the checkmate. So in this case, we're actually gonna explore this new opening. Is called Sicilian Defense, and it starts off with black pushing the pawn from c7 to c5, and as the pawn moves forward, white is going to try to do something very similar. White is going to take the bishop out over to c4. Now, at this point, let's imagine black developing a piece over to c6. Knight is coming up over to c6. And at this point, white is going to go ahead and use that same idea of getting the queen out to h5. And as the queen comes out to h5, guess what white is trying to do? Similarly, if black doesn't notice and plays some kind of a move like knight f6, okay, this is once again a very big mistake here for black, and white is going to take advantage of it, either capturing the pawn with the bishop or the queen and making a checkmate. So once again, this is a really sad way to play your game, where you lose almost instantly within a few moves. So you definitely have to notice the danger, and as your opponent's queen comes out there to the side, you're going to want to protect your pawn on f7, and the best way to do it is actually to block one of your opponent's pieces. So one scenario, let's imagine the pawn going over to g6. As the pawn goes to g6, we're going to block the queen from hitting the pawn on f7. That's the idea that we used in our previous example. Let's say the queen went over to f3 and attacked this pawn right there on f7. So the bishop and the queen are attacking once again. So in this case, we can go ahead and get the knight out over to f6. And this way we can actually block the queen from hitting the pawn on f7. White can try over from the other side, attacking the f7 once again, and at this point we can go ahead and block white's advances by pushing the pawn on e6. And at this point it would be close to impossible for white to break through along this diagonal. b3 to f7 is blocked off by the pawn on e6. Another way for us to defend once the queen retreats back over from h5 to f3 is to play knight to e5. And this is the idea is actually kind of cool, because knight is attacking the queen and attacking the bishop, and at the same time defending the pawn on f7. So this really fulfills everything that we'd want to do at this point, defending and at the same time actually counterattacking, making a little fork right there on the queen and the bishop. Now, thinking about this, why not be proactive, meaning that why not prepare in advance for what your opponent could be doing? And as soon as the bishop comes out here to c4, why not block it off? That's way you can reduce your opponent's attack on your king. And as the bishop is attacking this pawn on f7, it's not just about ready to take it, because if bishop takes the pawn, well, the king is going to capture him, and this will be the end of the attack. But at the same time, as other pieces combine their efforts to attack the f7, this may be a little bit hard. So what you would want to do is maybe just put this pawn right here on e6, and this will stop the bishop from hitting the pawn on f7, and will stop white from creating that attack. As the queen comes out, it won't even have a threat at all.